Good day, everyone. This is Mitch Milam. I am going to present to you a topic I've been playing with lately of how to programmatically import data into Dynamics 365 or Power Platform or the Data Burst or whatever they're calling it these days. A bit about me. Mitch Milam, I was a MVP for almost 12 years. You can reach me at mitch@xrmcoaches.com or on the Twitter, LinkedIn, or on YouTube where you found this video itself, and be sure to subscribe. So let's get right into it. So programmatically importing data. So as you know, you can import data through the user interface, but occasionally it makes sense to actually write an application to do this. Now this needs to be some kind of .NET application in most cases, outside of the, like say, plugins or something like that, because you run into timeouts, etc. when you try to do that. And in this example we're going to cover today, we're going to use a simple console app written in C# is what we're going to do. So we need three things to get started with our process. We need a file name, which is the CSV file. We need the Dataverse or the Dynamics 365 table or entity name. And then we need the import mapping name. So this means that we have had to go through this process manually at least once, and at the end of the process you actually can save your import map, which maps your input fields from your CSV file to the table that you're importing into. So that's called an import map, and that's saved in the data management section of administration. So you need these three things to get started. The process is actually pretty simple, and again, if you, as we were walking through this, if you can think about how you would do it manually, it's the same exact thing. So the very first thing that happens is you create an import record and then an import file record. These two work together. The import file has all the data. The import record really just tells it that you're going to be creating or updating data. Then we start a series of asynchronous processes, and they go in order. From parsing, which basically goes through the file and it parses it all out into a format it can use. Then there's a transformation that happens, and what this does is it matches up the data types of the import map and the target with the source file you started with. So for instance, if you're importing option set, it makes sure that the option set values match the option sets that you see. If you're doing lookups, it makes sure that the actual lookup ID that you set, or the name, depending on how you're doing it, actually matches. And basically it takes care of all of the kind of work that actually needs to happen to take data from a flat file possibly and then turn it into a relationship table that we have within Dynamics. And the final part is, once it's done all of these things, it will import the data. So those are the things we're going to do. So again, it's a very simple process. There's lots of little things that you need to kind of take care of along the way, and we'll cover those in just a minute. So that's the end of my presentation. Let's get right into the code. Okay, so again, just Visual Studio, just getting things set up. Again, this is just a very simple console app to get you started. And again, we need a file name. I've separated out the folder name from the file name because at the end I'll show you how I actually use this in production, just so you know. So in this case, I'm going to have it coming out of a single folder, but otherwise you can just put the actual full path here if you want to. There's no reason not to do that. The entity name is a custom entity called TLD_property. And then the last import that I used on this one was TLD property master. So that's the import map that I'm using for this. So going out, we just send out a message to the console so the user knows what we're doing. We're going to read the CSV file from disk. We're going to create a CRM service client, and then we're going to start creating our import records and then doing the process. So let's look at these functions one at a time. So again, the very first thing we're going to do is create an import, and really it's not much to it. It's just the name of the file or the name of the import, and this is what shows up on the user interface. And then are we creating or are we updating? So creation we'll cover in this. We won't cover update. Maybe I'll do, if people want, just let me know in the comments if you want to see what the update is like. That's where you export something out like in Excel, modify the data, and then import it back in. That's that part of the import file process. Before we get started, we need a couple pieces of information. We need to get the ID of the import map that we specified earlier, and then there's within that there's actually a special field that we need, or a field value called the entity source, or source entity name. And then once we do that, we go ahead and create our import record. And then we create the import file record. Again, this is the one that tells Dynamics what to do with all this stuff. So enable duplicate detection is true, so I do not want duplicates. I am the first row of the file has headers, so we're using a system map, which means it's already there. The name and the source are going to be, in my case, the same name. You can name anything you want. The source entity name, the target entity name we passed in. Content is the actual CSV contents itself that we read from disk. We have to tell it how big it is, and that way it's just a string, so we're just getting the string length. Pointing to our import map, and then we are going to relate the import file to the import by just specifying this field here. And then we have delimiters for the fields and for the actual record. So we're using a CSV, so it's comma separated fields and double quotes separate the data for strings, etc. And then this, we're telling it to process it. I'm not sure why you would use anything else other than process. There is a way to basically give it other values, like maybe for preparing to do stuff later. Not really sure. And then finally, who is going to own these records? So in this case, I'm just doing the who am I request, which is just going to go get my credentials, or whoever's credentials is running this, and then that will be the record owner. This is the same thing as one of the pages of the data import, where you're actually specifying who should own these records. Finally, we create the import file, and then I have several different methods here for just debugging if anything went wrong along each step of that process. And in this case, it just prints out some data to the screen, and we'll cover that here in a bit. Okay, so once we've created the import records that we need, then we start the process of actually performing the import. And again, 3 steps: a parse, a transform, and an import. Now I've got this flag called debug that I'm passing around, and what that does is, in this case, it doesn't actually import the data, it just prepares to import the data. Just because I don't want to import it, because I've already imported it in my case on this file. But it's just a way of basically just saying, you know, display some extra data if we need it, and don't actually complete any data import operations. So that's just something I built in. So let's go look at the parse. So this is, all 3 of these are really pretty simple. So what you do is you create a request. In this case, it's parse import. Give it the import ID that we created earlier, and then execute that. Then what happens, since this is an actual system job in the async operations table, we will basically sit there and wait for that job to complete, because remember, we're doing things synchronously even though it's an asynchronous process. So what we're going to do is we're going to create the parse job, wait for the parse job to finish, report any errors, debug anything we would like, and then go to the next step, which happens to be the transform. And again, same kind of thing. We're going to perform a transform import request, giving it the ID of the import that we created, execute that, wait for the process to finish. And then finally, we're going to do the actual import of the data, assuming that we've made it safely through the transformation process. In most cases, unless your file is mangled or not in a format expected, the parse process works every time. Transform is where you have data issues. For instance, if you have lookups not found, or data type is incorrect. A common one I get in my data sets is I have a date. The date is a character. Like I didn't check it before I imported it, and it's not actually a date. It's a word, like a missing, or not available, or NA, or something like that. So, but if we get to the import stage, we're pretty much just creation of the data. It can still not import records, but in most cases it will. So again, create a import records import request. I guess they ran out of names. And then wait for that to finish, report any errors, and then at that point we're actually kind of done. So if go back up the top and just kind of review that one more time. So again, create the import record, perform the parse, perform the transport, and perform the import. So let's run this and just kind of watch what it does. It's connecting, creating an import record, showing you my headers, creating the parse job. So there are several states it runs through. Suspended is when it creates it and it's ready, and then basically it will sit there. And what it's doing, and I'll cover this here in a minute to review the code, it's just waiting for 2 seconds and then doing it. Okay, we're finished with that. It just displayed the first 2 records it found, and now we're performing a transform operation on that data, and it failed. Why did it fail? It failed with the following error. TLD property entity does not contain an attribute with the name TLD parcel size. So what happened is the map I am using is old. And I did this on purpose, just to be honest. It is old, and I basically changed the property, or changed this field. So I had a design change request came up, and what I ended up doing was recreating the parcel size. I had the wrong data type selected. I had to have a different data type based on some other parts of the operation. So I had to create a new parcel size field, and then I'd remove the parcel size field from the system. So the mapping was from before that process. So now you can see it basically failed. Now we're done right here because it cannot continue, so therefore it did not get to the import process because it failed here. So we have to go back and fix this. And the way you fix it is just go back, manually do the import, align the fields properly, save the map, and then put the new map name in this application and continue from there. Okay? So there's a couple of different ways we can that I've got for you to do this. So as you probably saw, these 3 methods, perform parse, perform transport, and perform import, are exactly the same code with the exception of what it's actually doing. And I was sitting there thinking, okay, I've got 3 exact methods with 4 different words that are different. How do I make that one method that I can call to cut down on my code base? And I sit there 30 minutes later, had it figured out, and I call this perform import operation. So nothing really changed except for the fact that I pass in the request name and a description. And then this is kind of, if you haven't spent a lot of time with the request response messages within the Dynamics API, this may be kind of new to you, but this is the bare basic. This is how things are done internally when we do stuff. So we create an organization request with the request name, and we'll cover that in a minute. Then we have to add the parameters to that. So if you go up here, we're creating an import records import request, and our parameter is import ID. Okay, now I hard coded this name here because it's the same on all 3 of the messages we need to do, so that's fine. If you didn't, you could also pass this in if you wanted to, if it was different between the 3. So I'm adding a new parameter, and the way that works is you give it a key value pair. The key is a string, which is the actual parameter name, which is this name here, and then an object, which is the parameter value. Then I execute that request, and then I have to understand what comes back out of that request. So the response has a results variable that has all of the things that came back. The results will be dependent on the request. So the request and the response are tied together. So you make a request with specific information, you get a response back with, again, specific information, or sometimes no information at all, like delete doesn't return anything to you, for instance. So I know that I have a field inside of the result called async operation ID, which is the GUID for the async operation we're working on. So I retrieve that, I typecast it to a GUID because that's what it is. It's not an entity reference, it's just a regular raw GUID. And then I basically put out a message to the user that we're going to be running this, and then I perform the exact thing we did before, which was to wait for an asynchronous job to complete, reporting any errors, and I do that over and over again. So let's go look at that code real quick. So basically we have parse import, transform import, import records import. So these are the messages that the requests that were asked to be done. The only difference is really I had this code was in the parse import original method, and I just moved it here just to make it basically so I had one code base. But this is a way that you could actually run this exact code without having as much code to maintain. But again, like I said, this code is very specific. It tells you exactly it does one job and one job only, and the import or perform import operation makes you understand the inner workings of the request and the responses, but it does it in less code. So you have a kind of a trade-off there. So if you're looking at this and you don't know what this is, you're going to have to do some research. Whereas this, yeah, you can probably kind of understand what it is. Okay. Now here is how I would actually use it in production. So in my case, I have 5 different files that I have to import. Some of them are dependent on others. So I have subdivisions, owners, do not mail properties, properties, and letters. So some of these are custom entities. Some of these are standard entities. So what I have is I have the CSV file. I'm using one folder name because they're all in the same folder. So that's always the same. The file is different. The entity name is different. The mapping is different. And then I pass the debug flag that I set. And so the idea of why I'm going to all the trouble teaching you guys this today is if I didn't do it like this, so if I wanted to actually run this in production, I just change the values, point it to the specific folder, hit the play button, and it will run that and go through all 5 one at a time. Okay. Now, if I have a couple thousand records, it could take a while for it to run, but I don't have to be involved. Whereas if you've ever done multiple imports, you know that you're sitting there waiting for one to complete because you know in some cases. In this case, these first 2 can run independently because they're not related to each other. After the first 2, they're all related. So the last 2, or the first 2 are independent. The next 2 are dependent on the first 2, and then the last one, letters, is dependent on everything. So that's just the way it works. But the idea here is I don't have to submit something and wait. I just run this. It does what it does, and then I can go get a cup of coffee or go to lunch or whatever it might be, and come back and it'll be done. So that's pretty much it. Again, it's really not really complicated. You just have to figure out how you're going to handle things like the errors and stuff. So let's go through some of this. So I created these methods, debug methods, just to spit out relevant data. And by the way, this is all a modification of the Dynamics 365 documentation samples. So that's where I started with this. I didn't create this from scratch. They just had a very simple example, and I just took it and I kind of made it into different functions, different methods, and then created this code out of this. This will be on my GitHub, and I'll have that on a link in the description, by the way. I forgot to mention that. I'm sorry. So anyway, so here's a couple of cool things here. Get who am I. It just basically does a who am I request, gets the user ID, and returns it as an entity reference. The way for async job completion is it goes and looks for that async job ID that we had, and then it just does a loop until either the timer runs out or the operation is completed. And so it just sits there, waits for 2 seconds, retrieves it again, waits for 2 seconds until we're done. Okay. Then basically it gives a status, and if the status is equal to failed, which is a 31, it will actually display the error like on that the invalid field mapping we had. This reads the CSV file. There's about 5 different ways to read a CSV file. This is the shortest and probably just the best for CSVs. Here's where it reports error format. I just changed this where it was a linear format instead of a column format because it didn't make a lot of sense. But what happens here is if you've ever done an import and you've got failures and you open up the import record on the failures tab, it will show you this exact same set of data. So it's got the error number, the line number, the description, the column header, and the column value of what the failure was. Okay, so that's all good information. Like I said, if this is an actual production, I would probably just spit this out into a CSV file that ran, and then I could basically just append to that file with these errors, and then at the end of the run I could compare them to see exactly what I wanted. Here's where we're just getting an import map and the source name, source entity name, just standard retrieve of data, so nothing special there. Thing about this is just create the records, perform the parse, perform the transform, and perform the actual import, and that's as simple as it gets. So if you got any questions, please leave them in the comments, and we will talk to you later. Thanks.